please let me know. So we have Kevin Hayes, we have Dr. Okiki, Dr. Haft, Dr. Reedman, and Jean Ransom. Did I miss any of the committee members, advisory council folks? And then joining us is Ben. Okay, so with that, Dr. Reedman, I will turn it back to you for any sort of opening remarks.
No, I think we're winding down here with at least the initial stages of this. We've got hopefully at least one more, potentially two more meetings until we're done. We'll talk about that toward the end of the meeting. Dr. Haft has a presentation discussion tonight, and I'll move it forward from there. Let Melanie turn it back to her to kind of give the standard announcements, and hopefully a few more people get a chance to call in by then.
Okay, wonderful. Melanie. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Dr. Reedman. So good evening, everyone. So we want to remind you that the meeting is being recorded. In the event the meeting is hacked, please hang up immediately. And then I will send you an email through the MDPCP mailbox with a new meeting link that will allow you to log back in. The recording will be made available to the public. So please contact Anena or Melanie or send a chat message if you're having any technical issues. So you can mute and unmute yourself using the small button at the bottom of the screen. It looks like a microphone. Please remain on mute when you're not speaking to reduce the background noise. Staff may mute you if there's a lot of background noise, but you can always unmute yourself. If you're on the phone, I think it was *6. Was it *6 to unmute, Dr. Reedman? If staff mutes you, you can unmute. Okay, so you can use the chat function, but it does send notes to all attendees. You can't send a chat to a specific attendee with this technology. Please announce yourself when speaking, and everyone is free to speak throughout the meeting. Since there are a lot of people, we like to sequence the speakers when possible. So there is, if you're online, there is a new raise hand button. So if you're online and you want to raise your hand, if not, you can obviously unmute yourself on the phone, and we will give you your turn to speak. The meeting facilitator may also call on people to speak. So that's all I have for now, David. I'll turn it back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Melanie. Again, good afternoon, everyone. Also, I don't see any council members that I haven't announced. So if you have joined and you haven't been announced, if you could just let me know you're there, that would be great. I see Dr. Berenson has just joined. So good afternoon, Dr. Berenson. With that, Ben, any opening remarks you want to make? You good?
I think we're fine. I think we should move ahead.
Understood. Thank you. So, Dr. Haft, we'll turn it over to you. Operations announcements.
Yeah. So, thank you. Thank you very much, David. Thank you, Ben and Michael. And thank the council members again for showing up on a Tuesday evening. We're getting very close to the end of the year. So, I think we'll have a much-deserved break in a few short weeks, and I hope that you're all staying safe. So a quick update in terms of the CMMI meetings. We've had, I believe, 2 meetings with CMMI since we last spoke. They were both focused on the deliberation over the modeling related to group modeling for population-based payments versus beneficiary-style modeling, which we're using currently in MDPCP. And those discussions actually continue and have not resolved. We anticipate that we'll have some additional discussions over the next week or 2, which I think characterizes the fact that those discussions that we're having with our colleagues at CMMI related to many aspects of the plan track 3 will not culminate by the end of this year. We will continue to and intend to provide the guidance that we've gotten from discussions with the advisory council. You have been diligent. You have been absolutely engaged, thoughtful, appropriate, deliberative in every way in order for the state and the advisory council to meet the obligation that we set forward to come up with a design by the end of this calendar year. We will offer that before the end of the calendar year to CMMI, but it appears that we'll have ongoing discussions. I'm sure that is not a shock to anyone, that particularly in light of COVID and administration changes, other things, and just the natural complexity in government that a deadline might be missed. But this one, I'm fairly certain we will not miss. We will meet our deadline, but the negotiations and discussions with our colleagues will go on after that deadline, and we will simply just keep everyone apprised and involved, and continue to get your great input and guidance on these decisions and discussions. I'll pause there, and then I'd like to go on to just continue what we began last week in terms of talking about what a performance-based adjustment might look like if we chose to not use the specific design in primary care first. I wanted to pause to see if there are any questions there.
Dr. Knapp, before anyone asks questions, just to point out to the advisory council, we're welcoming Dr. Barr and Stacia Cohen this afternoon. Good afternoon.
Welcome to both of you.
Any questions to Dr. Haff from the group?
So essentially, is what CMMI tells us the final answer, or is there any opportunity for additional comment or discussion when we get to a product, or explain to me the conclusion process of this?
Well, so that's a great question, and I would say so far this has been, a very thoughtful back and forth negotiation with CMMI, with at least with the one issue that we really have come to discuss with them, and sharing our modeling, they're sharing their modeling, and we'll continue to discuss the pros and cons. And in terms of how that winds up, and I think will be based on continued discussions. But at this point, I think where we are on the beneficiary versus group modeling is discussing fine points together with our contractor and our learned contractor at H-Metrics in their modeling, and comparing that to the modeling that CMMI and their contractor Lewin has done, using substantially the same data, and reaching for conclusions that will provide some degree of, will provide the equitable distribution of funding to practices without significant disruption. So there's still some nuances in that. I think we haven't gotten down to a decision point, but I hope that we will soon. And if the discussion about this element is a way to predict what future discussions will be, that it seems to be very much a negotiation, and not a, as you characterize it, they will tell us.
Other questions at this point? Okay, Dr. Haff, do you want to take us through the initiation of the performance-based adjustment, and we can bring up the slides if that's helpful?
Sure. If you could bring up the slides, that would be very helpful. We'll just walk through those. So, and you can make it slide view. That's great. So last week, the weeks all blend together, but I think it was last week. At the very end, we walked through a narrative of what a performance-based adjustment might look like for track 3. And this was based on prior presentations by Audrey Spader and H-Metrics that walked us through what the current primary care first performance-based adjustment modeling is and what it does. And it was the guidance of the advisory council to us to say, let's not just accept that. Let's look at something that is simpler and more representative and responsive to the needs of the state and this program. I believe that there are a number of comments about the way the design went was kept things quite quite opaque for a long period of time in terms of providers being able to understand either the actions that they needed to take or what the results of those actions were. So we simply presented a straw man alternative. Does not need to be the alternative, but I thought we'd today walk through, again, just a quick review of what the primary care first methodology is for performance-based adjustment. Highlight the issues that seem to be of concern, that were of concern to the council, including some preliminary data analysis that H-Metrics did in very short order, and then talk about some general principles that I heard, I think we all heard, that should guide a performance-based adjustment. Discuss those briefly, and then walk through the straw man to see if it still makes sense to people, and whether we want to offer that as that or something like it as an alternative to the performance-based adjustment that's there now. Recognizing we have in our council many folks who are both well experienced and expert in quality measurement, and will rely heavily on their guidance in this process. So this is again probably a beginning. It will be at best a place marker in what we present to CMMI colleagues to say that we would want to do potentially a different kind of performance adjustment, but it may not be where we wind up. So why don't we just go ahead and go on with the slides, and all of that will make more sense in the near future. So this is the design taken right out of the RFA for primary care first, that describes their performance-based incentive, cost reduction, and quality improvement. And it is a cost reduction and a quality improvement program. So just in really quick terms, the first thing that practices need to do in this design is that they need to meet the quality quality gateway. This quality gateway requires practices to get over the mark for every one of the 5 measures that are in the quality gateway. Any loss of any one of those measures fails the gateway. Any one of the bundle fails the gateway, and then practice performance is adjusted. Only options are either 0 or negative 10%. However, if they do pass all of those, then they go into the practice performance being above the 50th percentile for specifically the acute hospital utilization. And in their model, acute hospital utilization is the linchpin for pretty much everything after that. So if it's a no, if you're not above the top 50th percent, then you go into the category of if you need to be in the top 75% of primary care first practices on. So this is first the national benchmark, and then the primary care first benchmark. If you're not in the top 75%, then you lose 10%. If you are in the top 10%, then you don't gain anything, you don't lose anything. So it's a 0 adjustment. There is then if you are in the top 75%, and you also have a ability amongst regional practices to gain that, but not in this limb, but if you're in above the 50th percentile in the national, then you have ability to compete against your regional practices, and you can bump up a little higher, up to the full 50 plus 34 or 84, whatever percentage that is, for the top 5% of the regional practices. They also have a continuous improvement adjustment, but all of these rely largely on getting through the quality gateway entirely, and then having either minus 10%, 0% if you're linked to largely to acute hospital utilization. And I should say this AHU is not our PQI, it's not primary care ambulatory sensitive. It's just acute hospital utilization overall. So that's the overall design, and I think as Audrey walked through it, when we go on to the next slide, and this is what I just said in terms of the quality gateways, et cetera. Let's just go on to the next slide. And the next slide shows what the impacts based on the H-Metrics preliminary analysis would be for practices if they all pass through the quality gateway, or if they all fail through the quality gateway. And you can see that color coded for the blue is what their modeled revenues would have been based on the previous modeling using our best ability using prior data, and then the impacts there are in for all pass and all fail. But it was clearly a predominant amount of practices were either negative impacts, that is that the majority of practices were either zero or they lost money in the modeling using our practices. Yes, sir.
Dr. Haft, can we pause a moment? Stacia Cohen has a question.
Yeah, thanks. Howard, for the acute hospital utilization, are they exempting all COVID cases from that?
So that was not, that wasn't discussed at all. This was so that would be an issue that Primary Care First would have to address going forward as they begin their program in 21. And of course, the RFA was written before there was a COVID pandemic. And the financial, the final text, version 2 of the financial modeling was not been released to the public. So we wouldn't have any visibility on that.
So it may be important for us to put a pin in making sure that COVID admissions are categorically excluded from the measurement.
Yeah, I think that would make sense. Of course, this would what we're presuming. I mean, we may have that issue next year for Maryland Primary Care Program as it is, because this 2020 was clearly an anomalous year, and 21 probably will have some anomaly in it also. So that's a very relevant comment for us. This model that we're presenting here wouldn't begin until 23, and good Lord willing, the creek don't rise. We don't have COVID in 2023 anymore. So
yeah, one would hope not, but it probably is in our best interest to at least log that in as a concern.
It is. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Other questions while we've paused here for a moment?
So, and I know Audrey Spader is on the line with us tonight also. I just want to make sure I didn't misstate anything from her analysis.
No, everything sounds good, Dr. Haft. But
Okay.
if there's any additional questions, I'm happy to answer them throughout the call.
Thank you, Audrey. Okay, and then the next slide looks at the same data in a different way. This is taking this, in this slide, it's a question of all pass, all fail, the quality gateway. In the next slide, it really looks, this now characterizes in practices that are winners and practices that are losers, if they pass the quality, if they all pass the quality gateway, what the impacts are. And it's still kind of a bleak impact for practices, whether you're a winner or a loser. A little better if you're a winner, of course. That there's still, it's hard to claw up to get to zero or above zero, using the actual experience that we've had in our program in terms of acute hospital utilization. So with that information, as Audrey presented it, the council said, let's look at other ways besides acute hospital utilization. Let's think about things that we might configure to make both a less opaque and a more practical and usable way to adjust performance, to do performance-based adjustments on the total primary care payment, understanding that the total primary care payment is a large amount of the primary care revenue for practices for Medicare. So the large amount, the sensitivity is much greater than it would be on a smaller amount of relative income. So next slide. So some of the things that we heard and extracted from the discussions last week in terms of some principles that we might base a performance-based adjustment on was one, simplicity for ease of program administration on one side. So we know that our experience with even with the current annual reporting on quality measures and other things that go into the design of the current MDPCP program is not without its administrative burden. the primary care first, which is more of has quarterly reporting and quarterly adjustments, and multiple inputs on those, and other nuances in terms of some which may be good, some which may be bad in terms of leakage adjustments, adjustments that are related to performance achievement as well as improvement, things that make at least the administration of that much more complex than what we're used to. And what we're used to is a little complex already. Same thing with ease of reporting. We believe that the easier the reporting is, the better it is for the practice to reduce their burden and allow them to focus on things that are more patient related rather than the reporting process itself. And that simplicity in terms of their ability to budget around what they anticipate their revenue will be is also important. And that quarterly swings of revenue, particularly potentially wide swings from -10 to some positive number, from positive number down to -10, could be devastating to practices that have a large degree of revenue from fee-for-service beneficiaries, and particularly as we move to these larger amounts of population-based payments, those could have significant budgeting impact. So simplicity and consistency in terms of budgeting. Making it understandable was another principle in order to achieve adoption and performance improvement. That I think several of our advisory council members commented that in order for any performance incentive to be meaningful, that providers need to understand what actions they need to take in a contemporaneous, as much as possible fashion in order to achieve those goals. And there were things in primary care first that made that difficult for providers to be able to do. Alignment is something unique to us, and primary care first is a standalone program to test whether providing the asymmetric incentives in a large degree will influence acute hospital utilization in independent programs around the state, for a practice by practice approach, in an aggregation of multiple practices probably for the nation, but different from the Maryland Primary Care Program, which sits as part of a state program which has separate goals, and our goal is to broadly transform the way we deliver healthcare for a state. That's not the goal for primary care first. Our goal is to align with the state integrated health improvement strategy. That's also not the goal for primary care first. And we have also the goal to align with the total cost, within the total cost of care model, and achieve the financial targets within that. And that's also not part of the goal of primary care first. So we said that we should be aligning, whatever adjustments we do should align with the state's population health goals, the SIHIS, and the total cost of care model. Actionable, that whatever measures there are in the bundle of measures, that they should be things that actually primary care practices can take action upon and will be able to influence those measures. So that the predominant measure in primary care first was acute hospital utilization, and I think the advisory council pointed out, and I certainly agree, that primary care practices have some influence on acute hospital utilization. They had certainly much more in the past when they were largely responsible for admitting patients to the hospital. That doesn't happen any longer to any great extent, but they do have some influence, but their influence is small compared to what it was in the past, and small overall compared to the weight that it had in primary care first's scheme of performance bonus adjustments. So we thought it was overly weighted there, and even though it certainly has a place, it should, that whatever performance measures we have, they should be largely actionable by the primary care practices. And then standardized, we know that primary care first does use national benchmarks for quality and utilization. We thought that that was also a good idea, that they should measure should be, to the extent that they can be standardized, national benchmarks, possibly also for in some cases also against statewide benchmarks. And then last was that some degree of consistency should exist as we transform the program from having a track 1, a track 2 that uses the current sets of measures in a certain methodology, that as we transition over a period of 3 or 4 years, that having that transition be that practices move to substantially the same design of performance-based adjustments would make that transition of practices as they move from track 1 to 2 to 3 easier. So having a radically different design as they move from track 2 to track 3 or track 1 to track 3 could be confusing and disruptive. So picking a design that's familiar would also was something we thought would be useful. So I'll stop there and see for discussion before we go on to the short.
It might be helpful if the council thinks about any questions they have as it relates to the design of the performance-based adjustments, to sort of lead into whether or not the program as proposed under Primary Care First or established under Primary Care First is consistent with the principles that were set forth here. And maybe that's a good place to start. So it's questions and an alignment to the principles. Station.
Sure. So since we last had conversation, I know that you'd had some conversation with CMMI about how true to the spirit and design of PCF they were expecting us to stick. Can you say a little bit more about where there is some willingness to deviate from PCF versus where they expect the spirit of both the program design and the measurement to be consistent?
Sure, Dr. Hatt.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I think it's been somewhat an evolution of in our discussions, in that we started by early in this in June when it was clear that we were going to begin this process. That the discussion was that primary care first is the way forward, and we want to have, from CMMI, so we want to have the MDPCP move to a primary care first design. And it was fairly rigid at that time. It was going to be a primary care first design, and there was not any further discussion about that. As we've gone through these period of iteration back and forth, and as we've had discussions about how much or how little of that fits into the milieu of a state-based program, the flexibility has been has emerged to a much greater extent. The only issue that we've had any significant feedback about and probably the only one we've really spent much in the way of back and forth iteration on, has been the issue of the group versus the beneficiary level for the HCC score groupings for population-based payments. We've presented the overall scheme of what's as recently as 2 or 3 weeks ago, but consistently the big areas, the big blocks that we thought that we would need to adjust to make it fit to the state. And we haven't had any negative feedback about that. But having said that, neither have we spent much time on deep discussions on those areas. But the short answer is I think that the messaging that we're getting is that they are very willing to work with us to make a model that works for the state. As long as it's a model that fits the large blocks of the primary care first design, which we've said we are making every effort, and the design that we have has a considerable fidelity to that, in that it is built on the design of having a population-based payment, a flat fixed fee, that the sum of those two payments, so there's a total primary care payment, that the larger amount of those two payments would be the population-based payments, that they would be risk adjusted, and that there would be a performance-based adjustment that would occur in at least an annual basis on that total primary care payment. So those are the kind of the fidelity, the big blocks fidelity, and we've agreed that that's, we'll keep that, but that there will be nuances beneath that. We continue to have a discussion, I think, as this council knows, that over the role of care transformation organizations in track 3 moving forward. And there's not so much of a discussion about the value of care transformation organizations, but the discussion is whether the federal government would want to continue to include them as a payee under track 3 or not. So I think that's kind of, I hope that's helpful, but I think the short answer is, yeah, I think we've been given much more flexibility than perhaps than what we thought to begin with.
So, Dr. Reedman, were you going to make a comment here?
No, I think Howard's done a nice job here, as we discussed in the past, about kind of summarizing our thoughts from the last couple of meetings and trying to come up with a more simplistic formulas. We discussed originally when the experts on this committee are looking at a formula being complex. I think it's a difficult thing to roll out to the general providers, and also I think this is certainly a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, the performance-based adjustment is absolutely complex. What do some of the other council members think? Dr. Barr, perhaps you could weigh in.
Yeah, first, I think this slide is a great summary of where we have been and what we've been speaking about. I feel, to be very frank, that we're retreading material that we have kind of come to conclusion on a while ago, and I'm anxious for us to make some decisions, to be honest with you. I think this is all very well captured here. I think Howard did a great job summarizing it. It feels like we need to move forward on the performance-based adjustment. Sounds like we got a model that we like in terms of the beneficiary assignment. Now we have to work through some of the numbers and get something that is simple, that achieves the benefits. It goes back to a question I asked 3 or 4 weeks ago. What are we trying to achieve with the payment model? And that's to support primary care, is what I heard you say, Howard, a week or 2 ago. And some of the modeling from the Primary Care First shows that it's really tough. And not only is it hard to understand, it's really tough for the practices to achieve using the modeling that was demonstrated. So now it's up to us to come back with something that is simple, meets all these objectives, and helps support primary care, to Michael's impassioned plea last week. So I think I'm ready to move forward. Like, let's go.
Yeah.
Make some decisions.
Yeah, that's a good point. Dr. Happ, how would you propose to tee this up? I believe, and I say that leading into it, but once before you mentioned that what CMMI is looking for is more of a policy framework and less on specific numbers. Is that still your inclination for the performance-based adjustment, or would you propose that we get a bit more granular with it in terms of payments and payment categories?
So I think that there are two in the slide deck to follow. There are two embedded policy decisions that we can come up with. One is to say that we would like to move to a simpler program. Here's a for instance for a simpler program, and in that program we would move away from having the whole block of performance-based measures need to be achieved in block in order for success, but rather score measures and weight them individually so that they would have their own individual impact on the overall performance adjustment, rather than the all or none approach. So that's one policy decision, moving from the all or none approach that's in Primary Care First to a weighted individual measure scoring. The second that we'll get to here is has to do with the risk tiering, the level of risk. And I'll do the fast forward to that, but then we'll get to it in more detail. And that is, once you get to that weighted score, the performance adjustment score, how does it apply to your risk corridor of the asymmetric risk? How do you convert that to an actual adjustment in your total primary care payment? And in primary care first, again, it's largely a 0 or a minus 10%, or then something. It could be higher than that, but most of the time it's a 0 or minus 10%, and then depending on extraordinary performance, you can move up to 50%. For very extraordinary performance. In this model that we're going to present, it allows a much less of sharp cliffs and more of a gradation, to say that practices can pick their risk corridors, much the same as we do in comprehensive primary care payments now. So they can start low, but they need to move up over time to a higher level of risk. But it still allows practices to start low and perhaps never get to a minus 10 and plus 50. That may not be a realistic goal for a small practice, but everyone moves up over time. So those are the policy statements that I think will come out of this. So the details, can be tweaked. Certainly, the actual performance measures themselves will be tweaked. They'll be different in 2023 than they are in 2020 for certain. We'll have learned a lot. If we don't learn a lot in these next 3 years, we'll all be very disappointed. So the measures that are here are just put in as placeholders. But let's go through the slides, and maybe that'll make some more sense. So I'll stop right here for a second and say this is really taking it from where primary care first is to a 3-step approach. The first step is scoring of a bundle of performance measures, so each scored individually. The second is calculating the weight of those, the sum weight of those scores together. And then third is applying the weight of those scores to the risk-based adjustment and coming up with a final number. So it's, I think, on its surface at least, much simpler to conceptually for practices to understand. And this would be done on an annualized basis. So let's go on to the next slide, make it a little bit more clear. Step 1, individual performance scoring for each measure in a bundle. So first you pick measures, and the measures would be chosen for their ease of administration. I think our colleagues in the commercial world, and Station knows this and has had my ear on this for a long time, and Michael and others know this. So much easier to sometimes to get claims-based or HEDIS-like measures. It would help us in terms of alignment. They're easier to adjudicate in many ways. And until such time as we have easy ways to extract clinical quality measures, they we'll make choices based on at least somewhat on ease of administration and data extraction. They'll also make choices for those based on their impact, the real impact on quality and cost, and particularly in Maryland, their relevance to the state integrated health improvement strategy. And then what I think is really important, but we can debate this, is are they things that primary care practice actually can impact? So it's great to have, really lofty goals, but if they can't do anything about them, it's just it's a weight that's put on primary care that they have to bear the weight, but they don't get any relief. So just to make sure that as we think about these measures, and again, we're not going to pick those now, but as we think about them, these measures would be selected based on some group of those things. We do this on an annual basis with CMMI. We'll look to the advisory council anyway for guidance on this. We would weight those measures based on their impact on cost and quality and their alignment with the state population goals. We do that now with the measures in the MDPCP, that some are weighted more heavily than others. Right now, we're weighting measures on CAHPS measures more heavily because we believe that those are how our patients perceive us as a critical issue. And then we would have benchmarks, performance benchmarks, where it's possible against national benchmarks, because that's, I think, the fairest way. We could debate that separately, but to the extent possible, using national benchmarks that are risk adjusted to the greatest extent possible. So that would be step one, just create this bundle. Next step two. This is an example of what the measures might look like. These are again just placeholders. We know that diabetes is going to be a big deal for us for the now and for the future. Has been in the past, will continue to be, as hypertension is. I know Dr. Berenson would love to have us have a better hypertension measure that's more relevant. I think by 2023, if we don't have that, we'll be very disappointed. But things that align with the state integrated health improvement strategy, we know we're focused on opioids, so having a measure along those lines. PQI is a more robust measure in terms of alignment with the things that ambulatory practices can impact than acute hospital utilization. So perhaps moving to something like that is more directly impactable. Patient engagement is always going to be a big issue, whether we use CAPS or other measures in the future. I think that's an evolutionary process. And total cost of care will certainly need to be included in because we're part of the total cost of care contract, but it would be weighted appropriately according to the impact that primary care has on total cost of care, and probably risk adjusted by the time we get to that also. So those measures then would be weighted given some weight. These are again straw man weights, but they might be weighted in some way that would add up to 100% weighting. They would have some degree of alignment, have some standards and some benchmarks. Next step two, is how much of the weight of the score goes to the total adjustment. And this would where the benchmarks come in. So if how do you score your individual measure? And this is, again, these are made up numbers, but if a practice is in the below the 25th percentile, they might lose all the credit for that. If they're at the 91st to 100th percentile, they get all the credit, and some range in between there. And if they're in the kind of the safe zone, in the mid zone, 40 to 60, it's neutral. They neither get credit nor lose credit against their performance adjustment for that. Pretty easy to operationalize, pretty easy for practices to understand once they see what their score is. And we would hope by 2023 that we'll be able to not only have practices knowing how they score against benchmarks a year later, but they would have some contemporaneous ability to see how they're doing against benchmarks. We've actually included that now in our dashboards for the NDPC practices for ED and hospital utilization against our national benchmarks. Not perfect, but gives practices an ongoing ability to see how they're doing so they can make mid-course adjustments. We'd anticipate all of the measures would have the ability to do that also. Next slide. So in the example for performance calculation, performance element A, whatever that would be, if the practice achieved 91%, they'd get 100% of that weight. The weight might be 10, and they'd get a score of 10% for that. And on and on. So whatever the appropriate measure, their achievement against the benchmark, the effect of that achievement, how it impacts the weight of that score, and then that percentage times the score would give you the total score element. Just sum those up, and it comes up to be, this is how whatever those numbers are. So if everybody's above 90%. Everybody gets 100% score. If everybody is below at the lowest level of 0, they would get a 0 score. Next slide. I'm sorry, not a 0. They would get a minus. We go back up to the previous slide. If everybody was at the lowest level, they would get a minus 100%, not a 0. Next slide now. So how does that all fit together? It fits together based on, and this will be the other kind of policy discussion that I hope we have here in very short order. The practices currently under how they pick their comprehensive primary care payments is they start at whatever level they want to start at, but then they need to move up over year or over several years to achieve a certain level, certain minimum level of by the end of the term of 5 years. The same way here, we might suggest the practices may not need to pick a minus 10% and a plus 50% in year one, the way Primary Care First is designed. And we know we've actually surveyed our MDPCP practices and asked them how they would feel, what they would do if faced with this kind of minus 10 to plus 50%, and then ask questions in the survey about what risk tolerance they had. And clearly it was about a third of the practices that said if it was minus 10 to plus 50, it's a no-go for them. And these are largely small practices that said they're not, willing to risk the loss of 10% of their total primary care revenue under any circumstances. Some comments were that primary care should not have risk, period. But we know in our model the risk is going to be, some degree of risk is essential, and progressive risk is probably a very reasonable and good thing to put into the model. So this presents, again, a straw man of how practices might move over time. What the minimum level is, we'd have to negotiate what the time frame for moving up, and what the minimum acceptable level is over time would be also a negotiation. But the decision point here would be for policy is, do we deviate from the minus 10 to plus 50 and allow other progressive risk to, and do we make that practice's choice, but they can't go back, they need to go up. So
Dr.
yes.
We have a question, Station Cohen.
Sure. So Howard, can you say a little bit about, I know you're just showing a straw man here, but you're showing a straw man over 10 years. And that seems like an unlikely time horizon for track 3. It seems like CMMI would be looking more at like a 5-year window.
Yeah.
So, and with an expectation that progressive risk was clearly articulated in that. Can you say a little bit about, just so that we aren't confused, that this is a 10-year proposal?
No, thank you, Stacia. No, it's not. It was just easier to put the columns in a way to spread out the numbers. So it's not a 10-year proposal. In fact, we know that, I think, what the total cost of care contract goes from 2019 to the end of 2028. So it wouldn't be, there's no life after that. So I think at best it's probably a 5-year or 6-year proposal, 5 years from 2023 to 2028. So that's probably more realistic. 10 years, I can't even tell you how old I'm going to be 10 years from now. So that's just, it makes me feel good to know if I could put something up here that makes me think about what's going to happen 10 years from now. It just gives me some reason for hope. That's
okay.
Yeah.
But as we think about the people who won't have the benefit of this discussion,
Yeah.
It may be helpful for us to put a chart together that's actually more reflective of what we're expecting to file with it. Otherwise, this was the thing that, I reached out to you that confused me. So I'm wondering if that might be helpful for others.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And what we present to them won't have this chart in it at all. It'll just be the concept and not this detail. But that point, very, very well taken. I appreciate that.
And we have a question from Will Daniels. Good afternoon, Will.
Hi, David. How are you?
Life is good.
Excellent. So I don't know. It seems to me like, taking a potential -10 adjustment and the possibility of a +50 adjustment is very good odds and would be fairly attractive. I think then the question becomes, if somebody is indicating that they're not willing to take that bet, that they can be successful with really asymmetric upside risks, aren't they indicating to us that they're unlikely to be successful in the program? And then do we want them in the program?
So we'd have to push back on that. And I think that, most primary care practices, particularly small ones, are just risk averse. They're not gamblers. They're not businesses that are in the business of, taking that kind of risk. They, would be in, Wall Street traders or do something else, or, in Las Vegas if they like those kinds of odds. But that doesn't characterize their practices. I mean, we surveyed them to specifically to ask those questions. And I think, in general, I think the response to primary care first nationally has not been robust. I think it probably is least characterizes the fact that many primary care practices, or whether they're good practices or not, and many of those that I know that responded to us in the no, either no or hell no to the -10 +50 are practices that are absolutely outstanding practices. So I don't think that the risk, degree of risk aversity that they have characterizes how good or bad a practice they are. It characterizes more the, what their risk tolerance is.
So, Dr. Reedman.
Yeah, I just wanted to answer that question also, Howard. I agree with you that I think there's a especially for the practices that have been around for a long time, there's a bad taste about taking risk going way back to the 80s in medicine. So I think a program that we all may be at the 1050 in 5 years or 4 years, but I think starting off with some kind of graduated risk, especially for the practice that are more risk averse, is not so much that they're not capable. I think they're just going to be cautious about starting off early. I'm getting some feedback. Are you guys getting feedback?
I get. Sorry.
So hopefully you can hear me. But I think giving them time to get into the program over, and again, 4 or 5 years is probably more reasonable. I think that is where we should be starting because of the risk averse nature of the physicians and the practices and all.
Right. But I guess that brings up the second part of the question, right? Which is, what are we trying to get out of the program? Are we trying to find primary care doctors that are willing to take a bet that they can bend the cost curve and transform care and invest in them? In which case it seems like this sort of risk arrangement would be a good selection mechanism for that. Or are we trying to get literally everyone in the state? And if we're trying to get literally everyone in the state, how do we think that is going to affect, how are we going to pull up the guys that are not, sort of very aggressive or willing to take a bet or a risk?
Okay. So I think that's a good question, and I think that's as you characterize yourself as the banker, that is the banker question. So, but I think the state's question is a different question. It's how do we transform healthcare broadly across the state so that we can deliver better health, both in the short term and also in the long term, in order to really significantly reduce the cost for healthcare by creating a healthier population. There's short-term gains that can be certainly made that don't have anything to do with a -10 or a +50 in terms of the gamble. And I don't think I think we're patently and not interested in only finding practices that are willing to take that gamble, and it could be a very small number. And we certainly can't transform healthcare across the state or make an impact on the costs of care if we have 20 practices that we've transformed who were willing to take that gamble, even if they're successful. The only way to be successful is to transform the large number, and the large number doing what they need to do and doing it over time would be far better than having a small number who can execute well and be able to be successful to get 50% bump and reduce a small number of avoidable admissions. So I think the answer to that is no, that's not what we're looking for.
So, comments, Dr. Barron. Ben? You're muted.
You're not assuming that a practice that it is in the lowest tier in year 1 is necessarily in year 5 at the lowest tier there, that you could kind of deviate towards higher levels of risk as you become more comfortable with that, so that a practice that's minus 1%, 5% in year 1 could move to minus 10 to 15 in year 5, correct? There's no kind of consistency across these rows that necessarily would have to be followed. As they became more comfortable, higher levels of risk would be possible for them to assume, correct?
Howard, you're muted.
Howard, you're muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. So yeah, I think that's right. And I'd probably caveat it that I would assume that practices would need to move up, that they couldn't move backward. But those would be more subject to more discussion.
So is the purpose to show a range, or is the purpose just to talk about that there would be a logical progression with the practice picking their preferred approach?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the latter, that it would be a progression with different starting points. And as Stacia had pointed out, that a progression would occur over a 5-year period, not over a 10-year period.
So at the policy level for discussion then isn't really the increments, it's just, do we agree that it should be practice determined, should have a progression to an endpoint over 5 years, and let the practice pick from an array of options, or are they defined options?
So if we do it the same way as CPCP was done, it would be a defined option, stepwise progression. But I think that's the devil in the details that we don't need to establish right now. But I think that would be I would think that would be the way it would work.
And then Stacia, you were going to comment.
And my apologies, because I've been out on leave for a little bit, so I'm still catching back up. But can you just clarify? We are not talking about insurance risk here. So I'm thinking about Dr. Riedman's comment about the late 80s, and you would find me in violent agreement with that. We're not talking about passing on insurance risk here. This is performance risk, and I think it's important that we have clarity about what kind of risk we're talking about, because those are two very, very different things. So Howard, perhaps you could just, if you wouldn't mind, being really clear about what kind of risk we're talking about here.
Yeah, so it is. So there's a fine line here, and I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to completely articulate it, except to say that we already passed statute a couple of years ago that allows practices to take this kind of risk, which does get close to insurance-like risk based on performance. That as long as it aligns with existing current federal programs. So there is risk here, and I think the difference between certainly, as you said, it's risk based on performance.
But it's risk for their fees, not risk against an entire pool of dollars that was paid on behalf of a beneficiary.
Yeah, but it's based on a population-based payment. So this is a capitated risk. So,
but only for primary care.
Right.
So it's really not a capitated. I just think it's really important that we're clear about what we're talking about here, because I can absolutely see why providers would say, I'm not going to take financial risk on the performance against all costs, right? I'm taking financial risk against my own performance. And I think those are two really different concepts that we ought to be careful we talk about in the right way.
Yeah. Yep. No, I think that's a good point. They are taking financial risk against essentially all of their Medicare revenue.
Their primary care Medicare revenue.
Their primary care.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah. So it's different than. So this is a large leap from the current program, which puts at risk just the performance-based incentive, which is in addition to their revenue.
Right. But it is not built into the capitation of the aides. So that's just the piece I thought was important to draw out.
Well, point well taken. Thank you.
Yeah, and Stacia, my point is that I understand that I've been on the committee and all that, but when you start talking about this, the groups that haven't been involved in it need to be. You're right, very well explained, because when we hear risk, that's at least what the older physicians.
Right. And that's why I thought it'd be helpful to tease it out so that as we align on what's the policy, then that actually lends to some talking points about how do we talk about this external to the group for the people who haven't had the benefit of the conversation.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, so
I agree. And I think along the lines of some of the other comments too, that, I think this is a great starting point. I think it's a great example. I think it gives us an idea, but a program that allows someone to start off at, and we can define this down the line, but to start off in that first column and any of those numbers in the first column, and then even a goal of they all have to eventually by year 5 or whatever be at that negative 1050 is not an unreasonable program either. So I think this is a good way to start it, but we can play with this table in a lot of different ways, but it may be reasonable to give the option of something in that first column, and then you move to another number at the third, but by the 4th or 5th year, whatever we decide that we're all at that minus 1050, and that's a reasonable thing. Again, we talked about this, you weren't at the last meeting station, but the goal of having the risk here on, improving primary care base payments from what they are now, which is lower than they should be, allowing coverage for the additional expenses of doing this, and then some incentive on the population-based payments. So again, I think this is a good starting point and a good example that we can refine in the line.
Other questions, comments? Okay.
The next slide just kind of puts those together. It just says, and this is now the column on the left is just different individual practices. And if an individual practices picks an upside risk of 50% and a downside risk of -10, and their performance score is a positive 10, then they would get 10% of the upside or 5. On the other hand, if they pick 50 and -10 and they flatline and everything, then they get the -10. But there are gradations in between. So if they picked an upside of 10 and a downside of -2, and they got 10%, they'd have a 1% performance upward adjustment. And also if they picked a 5 and a -1 and they got a negative 50%, they'd get a 0.5% adjustment. What this does effectively is it allows those performance adjustments to be great. So they could be a -10, but they could also be a -9 or a -8, and they could be 0, or they could also be a 2% up or a 3% up or a 5% up. They don't need to be all, go right to 25 or 50%. So it just gives a broader ability, a broader array of upside and downside to smooth out those curves. So I think there might be one more slide, I'm not sure. Yeah. And so then the adjustment is applied annually against the total primary care payment, which is both the flat fee and the performance, the population-based fee, and it would be adjusted on an annual basis. So 2019 performance would adjust the 2020 total primary care payment. And the example here is if your payment was $50 per beneficiary per month, and you got the 50% full bump, you would go to 75, was 50, and you got -2, you would go to $49. Not quite as draconian as 50 down to, if you had the -10, down to $45.
So I just wanted to see if there are any questions on this kind of approach before Dr. Half moves on. And again, it's less on the numbers and more on the policy approach. And I would mind inviting Dr. Barr, who encouraged us to move into the detail a bit more for a reaction here.
So you got what you asked for then, Michael.
Perfect. So I'll say, obviously this is a pro forma, a lot of detail behind it. I think Stacia raised some great questions. I think the art and the science is in the measures, part of the confidence building, Michael, that we'd want from the practices that, to your point, Howard, that they could succeed and then can affect the results of the measures. And so I think that's part of the work to be done. But as a general approach, I really like this. It meets I think if we go back to that slide with the principles, it aligns really well, and it's going to achieve, some primary care support, which is what we really are looking to get here. This is the slide I was referring to, David, right? I think it's it's not simple, but it's simpler what we were looking at before. It's in that same frame. It's understandable. It's aligned with the goals. I think, again, pending the details to be developed, I think clinicians and clinical teams and their staff could find the objectives actionable and comparable. I think the selection of measures, just to build on that a little bit, in addition to what I said before, we want to be able to measures that are generalizable across practices for which there are data. And I would really encourage us to think about the clinical data and how we can tap into that, not just rely upon claims. I think it opens the door to much more direct connection between the measure output and what the clinical teams can do to achieve that measure. And it's also more timely because you can get that feedback loop of quality improvement, not wait for claims processing. So I think there are a lot of great opportunities within the framework, Howard, that you just described. I'm more encouraged that we're here over the last few weeks. To be very honest, it's been kind of tedious. Nothing to take away from the great presentations by the consultant, but it was just like a lot of detail. So this is making me feel better.
Wonderful. Dr. Berenson, were you going to make a remark earlier, a comment? I couldn't tell for sure. No? Okay. Dr. Okiki, any thoughts here? And then we'll go to Jean.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah, I think I agree with Dr. Barr. The last slide kind of takes it back to what we're familiar with. We're trying to create this new norm based on the marching orders we got. And I think now that we have, gone through the motions and understood how different primary care first is from what we're doing and where the similarities are, and coming to something that's a bit more relatable and aligns with practice and practice is very comforting, I guess. The question is between submitting our final, recommendations to CMMI, then making anything out of it, and God knows what the new administration is going to do. I think those are the things I look forward to and see how we adjust quickly after putting a lot of effort so far.
Okay, thank you. So Jean, then Dr. Berenson.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I feel like we're in a lot better spot than we were 4 or 5 weeks ago. And I really appreciate all the work that the consultant and the staff, Dr. Haft and Dr. Ryman, everybody's done to get us here. Obviously, I'd much prefer a program where we just paid the doctors a lot more money and didn't ask them to do anything. That would be my perfect world. But I don't know if that's very realistic. And I think this is somewhat of a much more reasonable compromise. And I believe that we would be able to go out and explain this to people, which is really important to get engagement on these programs. And being the entity that ends up running around pushing this, particularly to the smaller docs, I think this is something that we can sell to them. So I feel like we've moved this to a much better spot.
I just have to comment that I absolutely agree 100% with what Jean just said, especially the part about paying primary care docs more for not having to do more. But especially the comment, though, that this is understandable. This is something that I, as a primary care physician, can simply digest and look at some actionable items and all. So I think this program is much more in line with what we can comfortably roll out and people will accept and adopt. So I think we are heading in the right direction with this.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Berenson. No? Okay. Thought you had a hand raised. Kathy Chapman.
Yes, I just wanted to recap. Different comments have been made this evening, but I just want to kind of regroup some of the thoughts as a small rural practice. Some of my concerns. One is, again, the complexity of administrative burden. If you have ECW, if you have Epic, it's not a big deal. If you have a small, robust, less than robust EMR, such as Practice Fusion, Amazing Charts, some of the other ones, it really is challenging. And the more complex the program, the more challenging the administrative and the reporting will be. Risk for small practice, that's huge. If you are a hospital-based practice or you're a large practice, you can absorb that risk, like Dr. Haff has already said, but it's much more challenging if you are a small practice. I still have concerns about the definition of regional, that Maryland is regional. A rural practice in something in Allegheny or Garrett County, the culture of the patient is way different than what you're going to see down in the city. I could pretty much wager a bet that most of you guys don't have to have discussions about deer jerky not being the best choice of a snack You know, there are things like apples and oranges and bananas. That's kind of a cultural thing that is challenging in the rural area. And the other thing, just going back at the very beginning, we're talking about blood pressure and diabetes. We need to really be thinking about the root cause. And the root cause is lifestyle, obesity, lack of exercise. And at some point, and I'm not sure if that is something that this program can do, but is really making more programs, encouragement to help people, educate them with diet, exercise, food choices. There are obesity programs through Medicare, but the payment is so critical that it's not worth doing. So, you know, I think that if we're really going to be successful in the long haul of improving the health of Marylanders, we need to kind of take a step back and look at the root causes.
Kathy, I think those are great points. I want to point out that relevant to that is as recently as this morning, we're meeting with another group talking about social determinants of health, and they pointed out that that obesity is an issue across the state, across the nation, of course, but remarkably in Western Maryland, the rate is 64%. Almost half again as high as it is in other areas around the state. So those regional differences are really important, and I would hope that as we get smarter, we're able to risk adjust for those also.
Howard, I thought you were going to say as recently as this morning you had deer jerky for breakfast. But...
No, that's going to be tomorrow. Thank you very much.
No.
It's really good with gravy. That's all right.
Oh, you guys.
So, if there aren't any other questions, then I would say, Dr. Haft, is it worth you summarizing sort of the takeaway for the performance-based adjustment, and we're safe to move on, realizing that we're just putting forth a framework for a policy recommendation as opposed to the level of detail and funding for each of these levels.
Yeah, I think as in the beginning, saying that we want our policy-based, our performance-based adjustments and policy to be based on individually weighted measures rather than all measures being bundled together and having to pass all. That we would weight those measures and adjust, and the sum of those weighted measures would be imposed on a risk level that would be a variable risk level adjusted up on a progressive basis. The starting point selected by practices with no backtracking allowed, and that the state, together with CMMI, would align those measures to make them aligned with the state integrated health improvement strategy and total cost of care, and the principles that we set forward here. I think that would be the sum total of the policy statements.
Dr. Riedman, any questions or concerns? Are you comfortable?
No, I am. I think this is, like we've said a couple of times already, this is a really nice starting point. We have the devil somewhat is in the details, but the details are all reasonable. I mean, we can come up with reasonable goals and measures and all those things. And there's some really good comments about, the blood pressure and control of diabetes really say that the patient's doing well. I've had this conversation numerous times with probably everybody and mentioned the committee, that if I control my patient's blood pressure and their diabetes is great, doesn't mean that their heart failure is controlled and everything else. So I think that we pick the right measures, we pick measures that are actionable, we pick measures that are going to truly impact improvement in patient care, and we make the reporting of those measures straightforward and simple. And we've had the comments that we just made about the EMRs is a really important one. I've said before, we use Epic, and it's light years ahead of what we had 2 years ago, which was we had used for about 12 years, but the reporting process was incredibly cumbersome. But most practices don't have Epic, and they have all kinds of different systems. So I think if we pick the right measures, they're actionable, we make this straightforward, I think we're really made a big step in the right direction with what we're talking about tonight.
Okay, and it's always good to get the consumer perspective. Kevin, is there anything that you wish to comment on from a perspective of the consumer?
No, all this sounds very good. It seems like we're moving in a good direction. I like the idea that we've moved away. I think this is true, that we're moving away from quarterly adjustments to annual adjustments. That makes a lot of sense. And everything else sounds very sensible. Thank you.
Okay, and Kathy, I see the hand new, or was it there? The hand raised?
No, it must have been left over before. I'm sorry. I'll lower it.
No worries. So, Dr. Haft, unless I'm mistaken, I think we have a framework for the performance-based adjustment, and we're safe to continue onward.
Okay. Thank you. I think that's all I have on my part of the agenda.
So, Alana, can you bring up the agenda back again? And I believe we had decided not to go into detail on the quality strategy framework, Dr. Haft, Dr. Riedman, or am I mistaken? I thought we were going to proceed to the CTO participation, but I yield in case I'm in error.
No, I think that's what we had talked about. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, Dr. Haft, do you want to frame up the CTO participation?
Sure. So, as you all probably know, the care transformation organizations were part of the design of the Maryland primary care program from the beginning. We, I think, now have 24 active care transformation organizations that serve more or less 75 to 80% of the practices. And CMMI has raised the issue and the question about not about their importance in the framework and support of practices, but rather their participation in the federal program. And CMMI suggested that practices establish an independent relationship with their care transformation organizations and on a one-off basis, and then decide to pay them whatever portion of, not even of their performance-based adjustment, of their performance-based payments, or just decide to pay them on whatever contractual relationship they might have with the CTOs. So, our position was that that the CTOs, as they're configured now, do have some degree of statewide organization. That is, we meet with the CTOs on a regular basis, share best practices, organize their contractual relationships with the practices are done through the state and then paid for by the federal government. And that seems to be working. I think there are issues still regarding. I think that HSCRC is addressing regarding CTOs and that are hospital-based and their relationship to their hospital-owned practices. But I think that describes a portion of the CTO population. At least half of the CTOs are non-hospital-based. So I think the question is, for us, is we put forward that CTOs should remain as part of the program and continue to derive some payment of their portion of the payment paid by the federal government as a portion from payments that would go to practices based on the direction from the practice, or should the federal government step out of that payment process and just allow CTOs to negotiate individually with practices for payment.
So I think Gene has a question or comment.
No, I have a comment. I really strongly support the CTO framework, and I think we need to keep it. And I do for the following reasons. One is a lot of the smaller practices would not be able to participate without a CTO. And what will happen is they will not go out and negotiate with somebody. They're just not going to participate. So we're going to lose them. And we don't want to lose them. So that's number one. Number two, at MedChi, I have helped numerous physicians over the last 10 years who got into different contracts with ACO related companies and got screwed. Was a constant problem. It's a big issue. The nice thing about this CTO model is it really protects the physician who aren't always in the best position to negotiate these kind of deals. And by having CMS write 24 CTOs the check 4 times a year, it's not that big a deal. It really protects the physician from having to go and deal with these things. And the CMS has some regulatory authority over the CTOs to make sure they actually are performing duties. And we're under contract as a CTO at MedChi, and so are the others. So it puts protections in place. I think this is a really important feature to the program, and I think it's part of the reason that we have so many participants. And I think we should stand firm with the position that we took before and keep them in place. Because what's going to happen is we'll end up with a situation where a lot of people will not be able to participate and are not going to go out and negotiate as they would. And I think we should stay with the position we took at the prior meeting.
Thank you. Ben, your camera's off, but you're not muted, just so you know.
I took off my protective mask here. We're in our office and conforming to the new governor's rules, but for the moment, I'm maskless. Maybe Will or Howard can comment on what's the record on the performance of CTO of practices that had CTOs versus those who did not. I think the point Gene made and the point that Howard has made that they are essential for some types of practices, smaller theoretically, but I'd favor a program in which there's greater control on the performance of the CTOs if it's to continue. So I know HSCRC has done some work on that. Will probably doesn't have it right in his back pocket, but maybe if he doesn't, maybe Howard does.
Will, are you available? Are you still online? I think, yes. Can you comment?
Hi, I'm still here. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. I know our analysis in the first year's performance results suggested that the mean impact was centered around 0 with, some variation, some CTOs a little bit higher, some CTOs a little bit lower. I think the non-CTOs happen to be on the little bit lower side, and the non-hospital affiliated CTOs tended to be on the lower side. But there was relatively little variation, and our conclusion was, that CTOs were randomly distributed around having a mean effect of 0 for the first year of the program. I do think it is, we should be very cautious about interpreting first year results. But I think the CTO versus non-CTO did not appear to be a statistically significant difference. But we didn't really see statistically significant effects in the first year.
Okay, Dr. Haft, do you want to weigh in there, and then we'll go to Dr. Okiki?
Yeah, I don't think we saw any. I agree with Will. I don't think we saw any significant effects on the CTO versus non-CTO in terms of performance on quality measures either. It was nothing that's remarkable. The only significant effects we saw is that Track 2 practices, as you would expect, perform better than Track 1 practices, fairly consistently.
Thank you. Dr. Okiki?
So Dr. Haft, I'm not sure. What were the parameters for doing the assessment? Was it just focused on outcome-based? I know that the CTOs also do some attestation. So that's some qualitative data. Was that when it converted to any quantitative data that was analyzed? It was just looking at those who had CTOs and the outcomes. The only reason I ask is if the question is do CTOs help or how was the impact on CTOs? The question is, had they not been there, right? It's almost like a VOI analysis. Had they not been there, would it have been worse, kind of thing. So if you had thought about that, if you could share more insight into how that was, the results were derived and where we see opportunity to do further analysis, especially in the qualitative information.
Yeah, so I think there's many reasons that we should have CTOs, and was a discussion today at the group that was gathered by ARC, a group of the primary care researchers from around the country. And much of the discussion focused on how primary care practices could put together the bundle of staffing and resources they need to provide comprehensive advanced primary care. And the discussion went from RECs to other kinds of things. And the fact that Maryland had CTOs as their framework was greeted with, well, Maryland always does something different. And you just live in a special place there that you can do those kinds of things. So I think they are really a very unique strategy and valuable to the ability for practices to access this array of particularly staffing that they need in a comprehensive and coordinated way. And I think they're meeting that goal. Whether some are better than others, I think is probably undeniable. And whether some will drop out of the market and others will succeed because it's a competitive market is probably also undeniable. But that's not the question that they raised. The question is simply, will we require that CMMI continue to pay the CTOs, or should they just separate out and try and do what they do without that kind of coordinated effort that comes from a federal program? So I think that's really what the question is, not the value of CTOs.
And can I also, since they're doing this already, it seems to me they should continue the experiment with this unique model and see if it makes sense instead of changing course halfway through. Why not go ahead and go through the course of this program with a CTO the way it was set up so we can see if it works or not as a possible model? I think we should stand firm on our position.
So let's go with Dr. Berkowitz, and then before Dr. Berkowitz, you begin, I would just note that we're 3 minutes till the hour. Perhaps this is a topic we pick up with at the next meeting, but Dr. Riemann, your thoughts on that will be great. Dr. Berkowitz.
I agree to table more of it to the next discussion, but just the point that I think that Will made, that I'm not necessarily sure that everyone was expecting that the first year of outcomes would be the principal driver. And I think to Gene's point, I'm not sure that anyone addressed his question around how would there still then be regulation of that and assurance with respect to the way in which they're working with practices. And, the last time we spoke about this, I was a proponent of allowing flexibility, and that if you are untethered, you may be able to have more flexibility in seeing the benefits. But I think Gene's point there is also important. And I think one would want to understand how there would be appropriate oversight and rigor to ensure that physicians are being properly interacted with and feeling like this is a real collaborative approach overall.
Yeah, that's a good point. So thank you. Dr. Riemann, we turn back to you for final remarks, and then to our executive director for thoughts.
No, I thought this was another great meeting. Again, I always appreciate everyone's input. I think we made some real progress tonight and have been over the last number of months. We're sort of in the home stretch. We'll talk about the next meetings, but we do have one more meeting next week, and then we're in Christmas week, potentially the week of New Year's, before we end up at the end of December. So we'll talk about that in just a minute with Melanie. But I always appreciate everybody's input and look forward to the conversation next week. Ben, you want to add anything to that?
Muted. Melanie did that, by the way.
I don't think that was me that time.
Thank you, everyone. I think we made good progress. I like the one concept that I think Stacia mentioned, which on the risk sharing, as we move through the years, there should be some convergence on the variation in risk sharing. I think she made that point, that we can start out with a lot of flexibility, but I think we should recognize that as we move into full operation, less variation is probably desirable for the program overall. Again, thanks for the consultant, Audrey. is invaluable, and Howard, Chad, his team, as well as MHCC, really does a great job of making this happen. But it's really the work group that yields the results. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ben. Melanie, do you want to wind us down here?
Yes, thank you. As usual, the meeting materials the reporting will be posted to the website. If anyone has questions on where that is, and that is obviously available to the public, we're happy to share that with you. So as mentioned, the next meeting is scheduled for next week. We did want to try to get a sense of council member availability for the 22nd. David, do you want me to try to do a quick poll of people? How do you want to?
We could send out an email with the invite.
Okay.
Just ask people to give us an indication in the email for a hold.
So that's what I have this evening.
Okay.
I turn it back to you.
Yeah, so thanks again, everyone. Just for the record, I would note that Will Daniels, Debbie Kuchka Craig, and Kathy Chapman, along with Dr. Berkowitz, joined the meeting today. And so we are past the hour by 1 minute. I think, as everyone's noted, we made significant progress today. Thank you all for your input. And Dr. Reedman, if there's nothing else, I will set everyone free.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Everyone. Safe travels.
Nice job, Howard.